So in this video, I'm going to review the long-awaited Poseidon Redwood. A lot of bike for not a lot of money. Find out what I like and dislike about it in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you're into the non-competitive side of cycling, riding party pace, and living the supple life, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. So if you guys watch Alternative Cycling Network, you know both my colleagues Eric and Michael have ridden the Poseidon Redwood, and it is finally my turn to hop on the Poseidon train and tell you what I think. If you're not familiar with the brand, they're consumer direct, and they seem to offer a lot of value for the money. The Poseidon Redwood is their gravel plus / bikepacking bike with some pretty cool features that you don't usually see in bikes at this price point. First off, the Redwood is all aluminum. It uses 6061 aluminum both in the frame as well as the fork. Speaking of the fork, it's thoroughly modern. It's got 3-pack mounts. The dropouts are through axle, and the bike is all set up for disc brakes. The bike ships with 27.5 wheels, and its stated max clearance is a massive 2.5 inches, which is a lot for a drop bar bike. It ships with some pretty fat meats with these Kenda tires that are 2.3 inches, and the wheels, although they're not set up tubeless out of the box, they are supposed to be tubeless compatible. The brakes are cable actuated Tektro disc brakes, which are okay. Moving on to the cockpit, there are some nice surprises here. A big one is the handlebar. It's their own design and in trend with more modern standards. It's wider, it's got shallow drop and some flare. Pretty wide bars, which I prefer even in the size small. And keeping in trend, it also sports a shorter stem. So you got that wide handlebar, short stem combo. For controls, it's using the Microshift Advent X, and I've done a couple of videos on this group set, and I absolutely love it. It's got great range. The shifting can feel a little bit clunky and mechanical, but it's charming in its own way. I like the general shape of the hood levers and how they feel in your hands. Aesthetics can be debated. It does have external routing, but this does make cable changing a lot easier. The crankset is a very practical and useful 38 tooth. Big kudos to Poseidon for speccing out this bike with appropriate gearing for its intended use and its intended user. The rear cassette is an 11 to 48 in 10 speeds, and again, it's using the Advent X rear derailleur. So this bike out of the box has great low gearing if you're going to take it, riding in the mountains or even go bike packing. The bike also has eyelets so you can run a rear rack. The seat post is a little bit chunkier at 31.6, and the bike is finished off with a Poseidon branded saddle that looks kind of reminiscent of a Physique Arione. So you get all this for not a whole lot of money in the grand spectrum of what bikes can cost. Bike comes in at $899. And on our scales, the total riding weight is around 27 to 28 pounds. So that's it for the boring stuff. How does the bike ride? I think this is where things get really interesting. First thing I noticed was the front end handling. Definitely felt like it had a higher trail than most gravel bikes. Almost felt like a mountain bike in the front. It didn't have super quick and precise road bike handling, but when you took it on the chunky stuff, it really held its own. The calculated front end trail is 73, but I think with the chunky tires, it adds a little bit more of that high trail sensation. All that to say that when you're descending at high speeds, the bike felt super stable and planted, and you weren't getting tossed around when you hit the occasional baby head. I did find because of the higher trail that you had to use a little bit more body English and also anticipate your turns a little bit more. It's not the kind of front end handling where you can change direction at the drop of the hat. You kind of have to telegraph your turns a little bit more and look ahead further down the road or trail. In terms of the rear end handling, it actually was slightly spicy. The rear end is definitely longer when compared to gravel race bikes at 440. I'm not quite sure if it was because of material stiffness, but it did feel like it had a little bit of life in the rear end. So not quite touring bike in the rear, not quite jumpy cross bike, somewhere in between, a little bit like an all-rounder, but still had some surprising kick to it, more than I was expecting. So overall, what I got from the bike was a bike that had a little bit of a kick in the rear and felt like a slackish mountain bike in the front. So pretty interesting from a handling and geometry perspective. Usually I associate more budget-friendly bikes with more kind of conservative and tried and true designs, but this one, they're taking a couple of risks. It doesn't feel like every other kind of longish gravel bike out there on the market, so a little bit more interesting. On flat rocky terrain, bike handled no problem, could ride it no-handed pretty easily, even over the chunky stuff. I think where the bike suffered most, probably not a big surprise, was in the climbs. You felt the heft of the bike, and also the fat meats of the tire, just added to that rolling mass. And it wasn't as snappy as some other gravel bikes that I've tested. That said, one big plus of this bike is that it is adequately geared. You've got a lot more options below 1-to-1 gearing. So for the intended use of this bike, which is screaming, ride me in the mountains or load me up with bikepacking gear, and for the intended user, it might be someone that's just getting into gravel riding or cycling in general, I think they really nailed the gearing option with this bike. It's finally great to see a bike OEM that is not overgeared. On the descents, the bike handled as expected, with that slackish front end geometry, just kind of cruise through all the rocky stuff. So that's enough for handling. What are my likes and dislikes? The first big like I mentioned, was the gearing. Very few bikes seem to get it right in this department, so it's really shocking and surprising to see, an affordable option nail the gearing. Another big like is that the geometry is actually kind of interesting. They veered away from kind of the tried and true gravel bike formulas and are doing something interesting at a lower price point. Another thing I like about this bike is that it's got all the mounts. It's got 3-pack mounts, you can run a low rider, and because the fork is aluminum, that means that you can run a rando rack, go basket packing without worrying that it's gonna stress out the fork too much. And of course, the biggest pro has to be the value. You get a lot of bike, you get an interesting bike for not a lot of money. I feel like if you're in the market for a journeyman and you want a bike that's a little bit more capable on rough terrain, the Poseidon Redwood is, to me, at least the more compelling option. So what are the cons? Actually, not too many. A big one for me is going to be the weight. It is a little on the chunky side, but for the price, you can't really complain. I think at this starting price, there's a lot of room if you have a little bit more budget to lighten up the bike. First one, of course, would be obviously to swap out the wheels for something lighter, go tubeless, all that stuff, and also change the seat post, and which leads me to my next con, which is the seat post. It's got a 31.6 diameter. I wish it was using 27.2 just for a little bit more added compliance, and plus I don't have any seat posts that I can replace this seat post with. Another quirky con is the through axles. Yes, it's awesome that it has through axles, but the way it's applied, you put the skewer through and there's a locking nut that's not fixed in the frame, and that has a tendency to fall on the ground. So if you have to repair a flat in the field or something, you definitely want to be aware of that, because if you lose that, you can't ride the bike. I wish it just threaded into the frame. that could have driven up the price, who knows what. But that is something to be aware of. I know one big question that a lot of you guys are going to be asking is it harsh because it's aluminum, it's got aluminum fork, all this stuff. My impression with these stock tires, which are definitely on the wider side of the spectrum, it took away any material harshness that you would feel. I think once you hit a certain tire width, the suspension that you get from the tire will override any kind of big material differences. That said, it would be interesting to ride this bike with something in the 650B by 48 range to see if the supposed aluminum frame harshness comes into play. But in terms of the OEM build with those 2.3 tires, not something to worry about. In terms of what bikes the Redwood reminds me of, the first one is the Salsa Cutthroat, and interestingly, in some ways, I think it actually is better than the Salsa Cutthroat. First off, it's 650B. I love that wheel size because I'm a shorter rider, and it just gives me more clearance to run things like a seat bag. Another way in which it's better than the Salsa Cutthroat is the aluminum fork. It allows you to go basket packing or run a rando rack. That's one of the big downsides of bikes with carbon forks, is that if you need some kind of added front rack support, a lot of carbon forks won't do it. It also has that similar slackish front end geometry, the Cutthroat, and is rocking the wider bar short stem combo. So kind of amazing that a $900 bike can hold its own in some ways with a bike that's definitely more upmarket. But clearly where it loses that war is in the weight department, but still pretty interesting. So far it's been a really, really interesting and fun bike to ride. Probably one of the most fun sub $1,000 bikes I've ever ridden, and I have no hesitation so far in recommending it. It's definitely not perfect. You can lose some weight, you can drop the components, improve the brakes, all that stuff. But for the money, you get a pretty awesome and compelling platform. So one big question is, who is this bike for? I don't really think it's a gravel bike per se. It's definitely a gravel bike plus. It wouldn't be my first choice to take on a event where high speeds are involved. It's a little bit too chunky for that. I think it makes an awesome bikepacking bike, or if you're gravel grinding and you're just doing a solo exploration, perfect for that. But a little bit too much bike, in my opinion, for a lot of gravel events. That's what I think. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, or any of you guys out there on the Redwood. What do you guys think? Do you have any more questions about the bike? Leave those in the comments. And if you like non-competitive cycling content, please consider joining us on Patreon. You get lots of awesome discounts and perks, and you keep this content coming. As always, keep the supple side down.